Welcome, everybody, to our Bible study. We're in the book of Isaiah, and we are in the 19th chapter today. There's links down in the description to get all the materials for today's study. I did want to say that if I happen to miss a day, sometimes that's just because I'm really busy, but especially in some of these prophetic books in Isaiah and probably some of the ones we're going to look at in the future, if I do miss a day, know that probably the reason for that is because the chapter material is a little bit more difficult than, say, like the book of Genesis, that I'm really familiar with and can get through really quickly. The chapters here, the text, the prophetic language is harder. You've probably noticed that as you've been reading through it. And so if I do miss a day, know that it's because I would rather put in the time to study it right and put out a good summary of the chapter rather than just rush something to get it out, just to have a video every single day. So if I do happen to go missing, that's the reason. And I think that's my responsibility as a teacher, not just to rush something to have material, but to actually offer something of value, especially since I'm going to be responsible for the things that I teach. So I just wanted to let you know that. So now let's get into our chapter today, chapter 19, which especially at the end of this chapter, it is one of those more dense, difficult passages. Like Assyria and Babylon, Egypt also struggled with pride, and God was determined that he was going to remind them of their place in his universe. So this chapter is an oracle against Egypt, but there's also a blessing spoken over Egypt about what would happen to them in the future towards the end of the chapter. So as far as our timeline today, we don't have an exact date for when this oracle was spoken. I would assume that it fits somewhere into the other ones that we've been talking about. For key historical figures today, we have Isaiah, our prophet, and we have the nation of Egypt, which was the southwestern neighbor to Judah around the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. And of course, they're notorious because they were the ones who enslaved the Israelites back during the time of Moses, and they had to be led out of Egypt by God to the Promised Land, as we talk about in the book of Exodus and Numbers. Definitions today, we've seen most of these. The first one is oracle, a divine announcement or a message from God. We also have the term necromancer in verse 3. This is a magician who practices magic related to the dead. And the city of destruction, this one appears in verse 18. And the identity of this city that was somewhere in Egypt has been the subject of long debate. Some people suggest that it would be better translated the city of the sun, which would point to the city of Heliopolis in ancient Egypt. But you can go down that rabbit hole if you want to, looking more into that. Definitely not something we can cover in a short study like this. Taking a look at the verses for today, I've got two sections. The first one is going to be the first 17 verses, an oracle against Egypt. So Isaiah's next prophecy concerned Egypt, and Egypt was a place that symbolized slavery, as we mentioned, and oppression. But Isaiah spoke of a day when Judah would be lifted up above those who once enslaved them. Isaiah described God riding on a cloud down to Egypt, and upon his arrival, all of the false gods and the idols, of which there were many in Egypt, they trembled. So the genuine God, the great God, is riding this cloud, or pictured that way here, going down to Egypt, and all of the false gods who think they have some kind of authority down there in Egypt, they tremble when they see the genuine creator, ruler of the universe. God was going to cause turmoil in the Egyptian territory, and he was going to cause the Egyptians to, first of all, fight against one another and to diminish the strength of the nation. They would run to their idols and their sorcerers, their mediums, their necromancers for help with all of this, but none of those idols would be able to do anything for them when it came to saving them from God's judgment. God prophesied that he would submit the country to the rule of a hard and fierce king. Now, along with these civil troubles, God would also bring natural troubles to Egypt. National, I suppose, also. He foretold that the land's rivers would be dried up and the earth would be parched, that fishermen would suffer along with those who worked with reeds and cotton. There'd be unemployment that would spread all over the country, and prominent men would fall from their pedestals because their industries would fall apart. God also mocked the wise men of Egypt, Pharaoh's advisors, who thought that they could somehow help Egypt out of this calamity through wise advice. He said that he would send a spirit of confusion amongst them, and they would cause Egypt to stumble around like a drunk man. And on the day of God's judgment, he would cause Egypt to tremble in fear of the God of Judah. For a long time, Judah had been afraid of the Egyptians. They had been a threat, but now the tables are going to be flipped. Now, this next section is really interesting and somewhat more difficult. Verses 18 through 25, future peace between Egypt, Assyria, and Judah. So though Egypt would be humbled, and the first part of this oracle is a punishment on them, God told Isaiah to prophesy about a future time when his blessings would fall on them. So some of the cities of Egypt would be heavily influenced by the Jews. This is what's prophesied here. And we know from historical sources that hundreds of thousands of Jews would actually migrate down to Egypt in the future years between this time and the 700s or so and Jesus's time. An altar would be built there according to this prophecy, an altar to the God of Judah. And some historians believe that this happened in around the 160s BC, when Onias, the high priest of the Jews, fled to Egypt and he built a temple that resembled the one that was in Jerusalem. Josephus writes about that. Now, whether that's true, whether this prophecy actually points to that or not, what is clear is that the knowledge of God would permeate certain parts of Egypt, and this would prepare them for God's blessings. God would heal Egypt, even claim them as his own people. Israel was his own people, but the text says that he's going to claim Egypt as his own people. And he would build a highway between Egypt, Assyria, and Judah. Now, a highway, I think in this text and in those days, represented a sign of peace between nations, facilitating trade and commerce and diplomacy and friendly relations. So one day the Lord would bring peace to these once bitter enemies, and they would all worship the same God. He would say to them, quote, "Blessed be Egypt, my people, and Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, my inheritance." So how was all of that going to come to pass? How do you get these people who have deep, historically grounded hatred for each other? How do you bring them together? That's what we're going to talk about in our application section. Judah, Egypt, and Assyria hated each other and had deep roots of bitterness reaching back hundreds of years. What could unify them and inspire them to not only love each other, but also to worship the same God? And I think the fulfillment, or the answer to that and the fulfillment of the prophecies here in Isaiah 19 at the end of the chapter, is Jesus. In Jesus, God unified all men through his universal sacrifice and his salvation. Of course, it was the Jews who went down into Egypt that set the stage for Jesus' work and Jesus' influence then to come down into Egypt. And there was a thriving church in Egypt for hundreds of years after Jesus came and after the apostles spread the gospel all over the world. Some really big Christian influences, early Christian influences, came out of Egypt. So Jesus was and still is the highway between nations. I think there's an application here. How can we learn to put aside national or racial differences and attain unity? Well, we can do it by spreading the knowledge of the universal brotherhood that's found in Jesus and the communal salvation that he extends to people from every background. Without the great unifying force and grace of Jesus, we all would just seek our own interests, national interests or racial interests or something like that. But we need a force that's stronger than all of those things to bring us together, and Jesus gives us that. So that's going to be our study in Isaiah 19, and hopefully I'll be back tomorrow, and we will be able to discuss Isaiah 20.